Welcome back to I Must Sleep, where we explore the darker corners of human history through the lens of education and understanding. Tonight, we journey across the vast landscapes of North America to the forests and plains and deserts where for thousands of years before European contact, hundreds of distinct indigenous nations developed rich spiritual traditions that included beliefs about malevolent spirits, dangerous supernatural beings, and the dark forces that threatened human existence and cosmic order. This video examines the demons, monsters, and evil spirits of Native American mythology from a historical, anthropological, and educational perspective. Drawing from ethnographic records, oral traditions preserved by indigenous storytellers, and academic research to understand what various Native American peoples believed about evil, danger, and the supernatural forces that existed alongside humanity in a world where the boundary between physical and spiritual realms was thin and constantly crossed. Before we begin, it is essential to acknowledge that we are discussing the sacred beliefs and traditions of living cultures, not extinct mythologies preserved only in ancient texts. Native American peoples continue to exist, to practice their traditions, and to hold these beliefs as part of living spiritual systems. We approach this material with respect, presenting it in educational context to promote understanding of indigenous worldviews, while recognizing that some knowledge remains sacred and is not ours to share. What we discuss tonight represents the beliefs that have been shared publicly through indigenous storytellers, anthropological research, and educational efforts by Native communities themselves. Part 2. The Wendigo Algonquian Cannibal Spirit. In the vast boreal forests that stretch across what is now Canada and the northern United States, where winter brings months of darkness and temperatures that can kill an exposed human within hours, where starvation has been a recurring reality throughout human history, where isolation and desperation can push people beyond normal moral boundaries, the Algonquian-speaking peoples, including the Ojibwe, Cree, Innu, and related nations, developed beliefs about the Wendigo, a supernatural being that represents perhaps the ultimate transgression against humanity, the violation of the most fundamental taboo, the consumption of human flesh, and the transformation that such violation brings. The Wendigo, spelled variously as Wendigo, Weendigo, Wetiko, or by other variants depending on the specific Algonquian language and dialect, was understood to be either a malevolent spirit that possessed humans, or, in some traditions, what a human became after engaging in cannibalism. The transformation resulting from the breaking of sacred prohibition so fundamental that the person ceased to be human and became, instead, a monster, a demon, a thing of endless hunger that could never be satisfied no matter how much human flesh it consumed. The Wendigo was thus simultaneously a supernatural entity and a psychological condition, an external spirit, and an internal corruption, a being encountered in the winter wilderness, and a possibility that lurked within every human when pushed to extremity by starvation and desperation. The physical descriptions of the Wendigo varied somewhat between different Algonquian traditions, but shared common elements that emphasized its unnatural, monstrous nature. It was described as impossibly tall, sometimes said to be as high as the tallest trees, towering over any human who encountered it, Its body was emaciated, gaunt, skeletal, with skin pulled tight over bones, ribs clearly visible, joints prominent, the whole appearance suggesting starvation even as the being constantly consumed flesh and never achieved satisfaction. Some traditions described the Wendigo as having gray or ash-colored skin, corpse-like, as if the being itself was dead yet animated by insatiable hunger. Its eyes glowed or reflected light like an animal's eyes, piercing and predatory and devoid of human feeling or recognition. The Wendigo's heart, in many tellings, was made of ice, frozen solid, representing the complete absence of human warmth, compassion, and social feeling. This icy heart meant the Wendigo could never be satisfied, never be warmed, never return to human feeling, forever trapped in its condition of monstrous hunger. Some stories describe the Wendigo as having long claws on its elongated fingers designed for tearing flesh, or fangs rather than human teeth. Animal features emphasizing its inhumanity. Despite its emaciated appearance suggesting weakness, the Wendigo possessed supernatural strength, able to tear apart humans easily, to break through cabin walls, to move with impossible speed through the deep snow that would slow or stop a human. The creature's behavior patterns reveal much about what the Wendigo represented within Algonquian culture. It was said to hunt humans specifically, to be unable or unwilling to sustain itself on animal flesh despite the forests being populated with deer, moose, bear, and other game. This specific hunger for human meat meant the Wendigo represented not simple starvation, but perverse appetite, the corruption that caused one to desire what should be most abhorrent, the breaking of the ultimate boundary between feeding and murder, sustenance and evil. The Wendigo never stopped hunting, never stopped consuming, its hunger growing larger with every victim it devoured. A brilliant metaphor for how indulgence in forbidden desires intensifies rather than satisfies them. How crossing certain moral boundaries leads not to release, but to increasing compulsion. The Wendigo was associated particularly with winter, appearing during the season of darkness and cold, when starvation was most likely, when isolated families or individuals might be cut off from their communities for months, when game might be scarce and stored food might run out, when the physical reality of starvation made the temptation of cannibalism a real rather than abstract possibility. Some traditions said that the Wendigo's approach could be detected by the smell of death and decay that preceded it, by an unnatural cold that exceeded even normal winter cold, by a high-pitched screaming or wailing sound that echoed through the forest, by feelings of dread and panic that afflicted anyone in its vicinity. These warning signs gave potential victims at least theoretical chance to flee or prepare, though the Wendigo's supernatural speed and power meant escape was difficult and survival uncertain. The process of becoming a Wendigo was described in several ways across different Algonquian traditions. In some tellings, the Wendigo was a spirit that existed independently and could possess humans, entering them and transforming them into monsters, with possession most likely occurring to those who were already weakened by starvation, isolation, or despair, creating vulnerability to spiritual intrusion. The moment of possession might be recognized by a sudden change in personality, by the person beginning to see others as food rather than fellows, By increasing aggression and loss of speech in human mannerisms, once possessed, the person rapidly transformed physically, growing taller, becoming emaciated, developing the characteristic features of the Wendigo. The possession, complete and irreversible. In other traditions, Wendigo transformation resulted directly from the act of eating human flesh, the taboo violation itself causing the corruption and metamorphosis. A person who consumed human flesh, even in extremity of starvation, even to survive when no other food was available, crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed, their humanity destroyed by that single act of ultimate transgression. Some versions suggested that the transformation was gradual, that the person first felt the stirrings of unnatural hunger, then began to crave human flesh specifically, then lost the ability to digest normal food, then underwent physical changes as they became more monster than human. The progression emphasized that cannibalism, once begun, could not easily be stopped, that the act initiated a process of corruption that culminated in complete loss of humanity. A particularly disturbing element in many Wendigo stories was that the transformed being sometimes retained enough consciousness to recognize what it had become, and to mourn its lost humanity even as it compulsively hunted and devoured humans. Stories tell of Wendigo crying out in human voices, begging to be killed, expressing horror at their own actions even as they continue to perpetrate them, trapped in a monstrous form that compelled behavior their human consciousness still recognized as evil. This tragic dimension transformed the Wendigo from simple monster into a more complex figure, simultaneously perpetrator and victim, guilty of terrible crimes, yet also suffering themselves, their consciousness preserved enough to experience ongoing torment at what they had become. The traditional response to Wendigo threat involved both preventive measures and active intervention. Preventive measures focused on maintaining food supplies through proper hunting, gathering and storage practices, on maintaining community connections so that no one became too isolated during winter months, on sharing food generously to prevent anyone from becoming so desperate that cannibalism became tempting, on reinforcing through stories and teachings the absolute prohibition against eating human flesh, regardless of circumstance. These preventive measures recognized that Wendigo transformation resulted from specific conditions, primarily starvation and isolation, that could potentially be avoided through proper planning and community support, making the monster partially preventable through social action rather than purely supernatural protection. When prevention failed and a Wendigo threat emerged, traditional responses involved the entire community. If someone showed signs of Wendigo possession, exhibiting the characteristic craving for human flesh, or beginning physical transformation, medicine people might attempt to intervene with healing ceremonies, hoping to drive out the possessing spirit before transformation became complete. These healing efforts recognized a window during which the person might still be saved, during which their humanity might be recovered if the spiritual corruption could be reversed. The ceremonies involved powerful medicine, spiritual combat between the healer and the Wendigo spirit, the community's collective effort to reclaim one of their own from supernatural corruption. However, if transformation progressed beyond the point of possible healing, if the person had fully become Wendigo and posed an immediate threat to community members, Algonquian tradition sanctioned and even required the killing of the Wendigo, despite the being having once been human, despite the horror of killing someone who might have been a relative or community member. The execution of a Wendigo was understood not as murder, but as necessary defense, as putting down a dangerous animal, as ending the suffering of someone who was already lost, and preventing the deaths of others they would inevitably kill. The methods of killing a Wendigo involved specific procedures reflecting the supernatural nature of the threat. The Wendigo's icy heart was often identified as the key to its destruction. Traditional stories describe warriors or hunters tracking down the Wendigo, engaging in dangerous combat with the supernatural being, and finally, killing it through specific means, often by finding a way to destroy or melt its frozen heart, thus releasing the human soul trapped within and ending the monster's existence. Some traditions specified that the body must be completely destroyed, burned to ashes, or dismembered and scattered to prevent any possibility of the Wendigo reviving or its corruption spreading to those who handled the corpse. The elaborate disposal protocols recognized that even in death, the Wendigo remained dangerous, its flesh potentially corrupting, its remains requiring ritual purification or destruction. Historical records from colonial and early Canadian sources document cases identified as Wendigo psychosis or Wendigo possession, instances where individuals, usually during periods of starvation and isolation, reported overwhelming compulsion to eat human flesh, exhibited behavior consistent with traditional Wendigo descriptions, and in some cases were executed by their own communities as the only means of preventing cannibalistic violence. These documented cases raise complex questions about the relationship between cultural belief and psychological condition, about how traditional frameworks for understanding mental illness or extreme psychological distress might manifest in culture-specific ways, about whether what Euro-Americans called psychosis was better understood within Algonquian framework as genuine spiritual possession. The most famous documented case involved a Cree man named Swift Runner, who in 1879 was convicted by Canadian authorities of murdering and cannibalizing his wife and 5 children during a particularly harsh winter, despite, according to some accounts, having access to other food sources at a Hudson's Bay Company post within reasonable distance. Swift Runner claimed to have been possessed by the Wendigo spirit, to have been unable to control his actions, to have been transformed into something no longer human. His own Cree community reportedly believed his possession was genuine and had intended to execute him themselves, according to traditional practices, before Canadian authorities intervened, arrested him, conducted a trial that treated him as a criminal rather than a supernatural being, and hanged him. The case illustrates the collision between Indigenous spiritual frameworks and Western legal systems, between traditional community justice and colonial authority, between concepts of individual criminal responsibility and spiritual possession. The Wendigo's significance within Algonquian culture extended far beyond simple monster stories or supernatural threats. At its deepest level, the Wendigo represented the dangers of isolation from community, the catastrophic consequences of putting individual survival above social bonds, the recognition that humans are fundamentally social beings who lose their humanity when separated from others. In the harsh environment of the northern forests, where survival required cooperation, sharing, and collective effort, the Wendigo served as a powerful warning against selfishness, against hoarding food while others starved, against the individualism that prioritized one's own life at the expense of community members. The Wendigo was the ultimate embodiment of antisocial behavior, the fate awaiting those who broke the most fundamental social contracts. The Wendigo also served important psychological functions, providing an outlet for discussing the undiscussable, creating a framework for acknowledging that, under conditions of extreme starvation, humans might experience intrusive thoughts about cannibalism, might face temptations they found horrifying, might struggle with urges that, under normal circumstances, would never arise. By externalizing these thoughts and urges as a possessing spirit, as something outside the self rather than arising from within, Algonquian tradition created a way to discuss and prepare for these extreme psychological states without implying that having such thoughts made one inherently evil or abnormal. The possession framework recognized the difference between being tempted and acting on temptation, between experiencing intrusive thoughts and choosing to implement them, providing psychological sophistication in understanding the human mind under extreme stress. Modern Native American writers and thinkers have explored the Wendigo as a metaphor for various contemporary issues facing indigenous communities and the wider world. The Wendigo's insatiable hunger that grows with feeding has been compared to capitalism's requirement for endless growth and consumption, to addiction's escalating demands, to environmental destruction driven by corporate greed that can never be satisfied no matter how much is extracted and consumed. The Wendigo's transformation from human to monster through breaking fundamental boundaries has been used to discuss cultural assimilation, the loss of indigenous identity, the corruption that comes from betraying one's community and values for personal gain. These modern interpretations demonstrate the continuing relevance and adaptability of traditional stories, their capacity to address contemporary concerns while remaining rooted in ancient wisdom. The Wendigo has also entered popular culture, appearing in horror films, novels, video games, and television shows, usually stripped of its cultural context and reduced to a generic monster. A creature of scary appearance, without the deeper meanings, the being held within Algonquian tradition. This popular culture appropriation has caused concern among some Native people who view it as another form of cultural theft, taking indigenous sacred or important stories and using them as entertainment without permission or understanding, and without benefit to Native communities. Other Native people have worked to reclaim the Wendigo narrative, creating works that present the being within proper cultural context, that explore its traditional meanings, that use the figure to discuss indigenous experiences and perspectives, attempting to maintain some control over how their traditions are represented and interpreted. The ethical questions surrounding non-Native people telling or using Wendigo stories remain unresolved and contentious. Some argue that these are cultural property of specific Algonquian nations, that outsiders have no right to use them, that doing so perpetuates colonial dynamics of extraction and appropriation. Others suggest that the Wendigo addresses universal human concerns about the boundaries of morality under extreme conditions, that the story has value beyond its specific cultural origin, that respectful engagement that credits sources and acknowledges limitations can be appropriate. These debates reflect broader discussions about cultural appropriation, intellectual property, and the ethics of cross-cultural learning and sharing in a post-colonial world. But for the Algonquian peoples who have lived with Wendigo beliefs for centuries or millennia, passed the stories from generation to generation, use them to navigate the psychological and social challenges of life in harsh environments where survival depended on maintaining humanity in the face of extremity, the Wendigo remains a powerful and important part of cultural tradition. Whether understood as a literal supernatural being, a psychological condition, a metaphor, or some combination of these interpretations, the Wendigo continues to serve its functions, to encode survival wisdom, to warn against the dangers that lurk not just in the winter forests, but within human nature itself, to remind that civilization and humanity are fragile achievements constantly threatened by circumstances and choices that can reduce humans to monsters. Part 3. Skinwalkers, Navajo Witchcraft, and Yee Naaldlooshii. In the high desert and canyon country of the American Southwest, in the territory of the Diné or Navajo Nation, there exists a belief in beings called Skinwalkers, practitioners of the darkest form of witchcraft who have acquired the power to transform themselves into animals, and who use this power to harm, to spread disease and misfortune, to terrorize and kill. Having abandoned the Navajo way of Hoji, or balance and harmony, to pursue selfish power and malevolent purposes through violation of the most sacred taboos. The Navajo term is Yee Naaldlooshii, which translates approximately as, "With it he goes on all fours," or "By means of it, it goes on all fours," emphasizing the transformation from human to animal form that defines these beings. Before examining skinwalkers in detail, it is essential to acknowledge that this topic is extremely sensitive within Navajo culture, that discussing skinwalkers is itself considered dangerous, that speaking about them can attract their attention or give them power, and that much of the most important knowledge about them is restricted, not appropriate for public discussion, even among Navajo people, and certainly not for outside audiences. Many Navajo people refuse to discuss skinwalkers at all, especially with outsiders, considering such discussion to be disrespectful, dangerous, or inappropriate. The information that has entered public discourse comes primarily from Navajo people who have chosen to share certain aspects of these beliefs through books, interviews, and educational contexts, always with significant portions remaining private and sacred. We proceed with respect for these boundaries, discussing only what has been publicly shared while acknowledging that our understanding remains incomplete and that the full depth of Navajo beliefs about skinwalkers is not ours to access. Skinwalkers in Navajo tradition are not simply shapeshifters or were creatures in the European sense, but rather are witches who have achieved the ability to transform into animal form through specific means that involve the deliberate violation of fundamental Navajo values and taboos. The process of becoming a skinwalker, according to the limited information that has been shared publicly, requires the practitioner to kill a close family member, usually a sibling or other immediate relative, in a ritualized manner, using the act of murder against one's own kin as the means to acquire dark power. This requirement of ultimate betrayal, of destroying the family bonds that are central to Navajo society, ensures that anyone who becomes a skinwalker has completely rejected the Navajo way of life and the values of kinship, reciprocity, and harmony that govern proper behavior. The transformation itself supposedly involves the use of the skin of the animal the witch wishes to become, wearing the pelt like a garment, and through ritual means achieving the ability to actually become that animal, to gain its physical form and abilities, while retaining human intelligence and malicious intent. Common animal forms associated with skinwalkers include coyotes, wolves, foxes, crows, and owls, though accounts mention other animals as well. The choice of animal form might relate to what abilities the skinwalker wished to gain. Coyote form for speed and stealth, wolf form for strength and pack hunting ability, owl or crow form for flight and nocturnal movement, each animal providing different tactical advantages for the skinwalker's malicious purposes. Descriptions of skinwalkers in animal form emphasize their unnaturalness, the ways they differ from ordinary animals, and reveal themselves as something wrong and dangerous. They might have eyes that reflect light in unnatural colors, red or yellow or white, rather than the normal eye shine of that animal. They might move in ways that seem wrong, running on hind legs like a human despite being in animal form, or achieving speeds impossible for normal animals, or navigating terrain that should be impassable. They might make sounds that combine animal and human vocalization, or speak in human languages while in animal form, or create sounds specifically designed to unsettle and terrify witnesses. These unnatural characteristics serve to identify encounters with skinwalkers as opposed to ordinary animal sightings, providing warning that something supernatural and dangerous is present. Skinwalker sightings typically occur at night, these witches being primarily nocturnal in their activities, using darkness to conceal their movements and maximize the fear their presence generates. Common scenarios in skinwalker accounts include seeing an animal running alongside a vehicle on a remote road at impossible speeds, sometimes keeping pace with cars traveling 60 or 70 miles per hour, the animal's eyes reflecting in the headlights, the experience generating intense fear, and the knowledge that this is not a normal animal. Other accounts describe animals approaching homes, peering into windows, circling buildings, attempting to enter, their presence feeling malevolent and threatening, their behavior unlike normal wildlife which typically avoids human habitation. Some accounts describe skinwalkers in partial transformation, appearing as something between human and animal, a horrifying hybrid form that might have an animal head on a human body, or human limbs on an animal torso, or features of multiple animals combined with human characteristics, these transitional forms perhaps representing the moment of transformation, or perhaps deliberate choices to appear in the most disturbing possible form to maximize the psychological impact on witnesses. The visceral horror of these hybrid descriptions reveals deep anxieties about the boundaries between human and animal, about the stability of form and identity, about things that should remain separate becoming mixed. The motivations attributed to skinwalkers vary somewhat, but generally center on the use of their powers to harm others for personal gain or satisfaction. They are said to spread disease through various means, blowing corpse powder made from ground human bones into people's faces or through their windows, the contamination causing illness that worsens over time and resists normal treatment. They kill livestock belonging to people they wish to harm, not for food, but specifically to cause economic damage and to spread fear. They cause accidents, mechanical failures, getting vehicles to break down in dangerous locations, causing people to crash or become stranded. They harm or kill people directly through supernatural means, causing sudden illnesses, heart attacks, strokes, or mysterious deaths that appear natural but are actually murder through witchcraft. Some traditions suggest skinwalkers target specific individuals for personal reasons, engaging in witchcraft against people who have offended them, who have been successful in ways that generate envy, who possess things the skinwalker covets, who have rejected the skinwalker's advances or slighted them in some way. This personal motivation transforms skinwalker attacks from random danger to targeted malice, making them even more frightening because anyone who prospers or stands out risks attracting skinwalker attention and hatred. Other accounts suggest skinwalkers sometimes act from pure malice without specific personal motivation, choosing victims arbitrarily, spreading harm for its own sake, embodying evil that requires no justification beyond the pleasure derived from causing suffering. Protection against skinwalkers in Navajo tradition involves multiple approaches reflecting the supernatural nature of the threat. Maintaining Hoji, living in balance and harmony, following the Navajo way properly, creates spiritual protection that makes one a difficult target for witchcraft. The positive spiritual state acting as armor against malevolent spiritual attack. Specific protective ceremonies can be performed by medicine people, elaborate rituals that purify potential victims, strengthen their spiritual defenses, and drive away or bind skinwalkers who might be targeting them. Various protective materials and objects, blessed by medicine people and carried or placed strategically, provide ongoing protection, though the specific nature of these protections remains largely private knowledge. Some traditions hold that skinwalkers fear certain things that can be used as defense against them. White ash is sometimes mentioned as a substance they avoid, creating barriers of white ash around homes or carrying it as protection. Certain songs and prayers, spoken or sung at the moment of encounter, are said to repel or weaken skinwalkers, though the specific words and proper procedures for these protections are not publicly shared. Firearms might be effective against skinwalkers in animal form, though accounts disagree about whether normal weapons can harm beings who might have supernatural invulnerability. And some stories suggest that wounding or killing a skinwalker in animal form would reveal the human witch beneath, exposing their identity and bringing community justice upon them. The revelation of a skinwalker's human identity represents one of the most dangerous moments in these encounters, for skinwalkers are real human members of Navajo communities, neighbors and relatives who hide their dark practices behind respectable facades, who live among others while secretly practicing witchcraft. If a skinwalker's identity becomes known, they face serious consequences, including possible execution by the community, making them desperate to conceal their activities and willing to kill anyone who might expose them. This necessity for secrecy means that people who suspect skinwalker activity are themselves at risk, creating an atmosphere of fear and mistrust, where speaking openly about suspicions might attract deadly retaliation from the witch being discussed. The psychology of skinwalker beliefs reveals important dimensions of Navajo social life and values. In a culture that emphasizes harmony, balance, and proper relationships, Skinwalkers represent the ultimate antisocial threat. Individuals who have chosen to reject all social bonds and community values in pursuit of selfish power, who prey upon their own people rather than supporting them, who create fear and division rather than cooperation and trust. The requirement that one must murder a close family member to become a skinwalker emphasizes the complete break with normal humanity that witchcraft represents, the destruction of the most fundamental relationships, the transformation from human being embedded in kinship networks to isolated predator who recognizes no bonds or obligations. Skinwalker beliefs also provide a framework for discussing and addressing real social problems within Navajo communities. A way to talk about individuals whose behavior harms others, about unexplained illnesses or misfortunes that might actually result from environmental factors or human malice rather than supernatural causes. About the existence of evil within the community rather than only outside it, like many witch beliefs worldwide. Skinwalker traditions acknowledge that not all harm comes from external enemies or natural causes, but that some people within one's own society may actively work to cause suffering, that evil can wear a familiar face. That danger lurks not just in the wilderness, but in the village itself. Modern Navajo people hold varying positions on skinwalker beliefs, ranging from strong literal belief in the existence of these witches and their supernatural powers, to skeptical interpretations that view skinwalker stories as metaphorical or as misidentifications of natural phenomena, to positions that acknowledge the cultural importance of these beliefs regardless of their literal truth, to outsider perspectives influenced by Western education that dismiss skinwalkers as superstition while still respecting their cultural significance. Many Navajo people report personal experiences they interpret as skinwalker encounters, describing events that frightened them profoundly and that they cannot explain through normal means. These contemporary accounts demonstrating the continuing vitality of skinwalker beliefs in modern Navajo life. The location known as Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, near the Navajo Nation, has become famous through books, television shows, and paranormal investigation programs that claim the area experiences unusual phenomena, including UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, and various supernatural events that some have linked to skinwalker activity. Many Navajo people view this commercial exploitation of skinwalker beliefs with dismay and anger, seeing it as yet another example of outsiders appropriating indigenous sacred or important knowledge, stripping it of cultural context, sensationalizing it for profit, and creating inaccurate or disrespectful representations that have nothing to do with actual Navajo traditions. The ranch and associated media have brought enormous attention to skinwalkers while simultaneously spreading misinformation and treating serious Navajo beliefs as entertainment, illustrating the ongoing challenges Indigenous peoples face in maintaining control over their own cultural narratives. Modern Navajo people hold varying positions on skinwalker beliefs, ranging from strong literal belief in the existence of these witches and their supernatural powers, to skeptical interpretations that view skinwalker stories as metaphorical or as misidentifications of natural phenomena, to positions that acknowledge the cultural importance of these beliefs regardless of their literal truth, to outsider perspectives influenced by Western education that dismiss skinwalkers as superstition while still respecting their cultural significance. Many Navajo people report personal experiences they interpret as skinwalker encounters, describing events that frightened them profoundly, and that they cannot explain through normal means. These contemporary accounts demonstrating the continuing vitality of Skinwalker beliefs in modern Navajo life. The location known as Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, near the Navajo Nation, has become famous through books, television shows, and paranormal investigation programs that claim the area experiences unusual phenomena, including UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, and various supernatural events that some have linked to Skinwalker activity. Many Navajo people view this commercial exploitation of Skinwalker beliefs with dismay and anger, seeing it as yet another example of outsiders appropriating indigenous sacred or important knowledge, stripping it of cultural context, sensationalizing it for profit, and creating inaccurate or disrespectful representations that have nothing to do with actual Navajo traditions. The ranch and associated media have brought enormous attention to Skinwalkers, while simultaneously spreading misinformation and treating serious Navajo beliefs as entertainment, illustrating the ongoing challenges Indigenous peoples face in maintaining control over their own cultural narratives. Skinwalkers have appeared in various forms of popular media, including horror films, television shows, novels, and video games, almost always depicted incorrectly, removed from Navajo cultural context, confused with European werewolf legends or other shapeshifter traditions, reduced to generic monsters without the specific cultural meanings they carry within Navajo tradition. Some Navajo people and supporters have called for these appropriative uses to stop, arguing that Skinwalkers are not public domain material for anyone to use, but rather are part of living Navajo spiritual tradition that outsiders should not exploit. Others have attempted to create more accurate representations that present Skinwalkers within proper cultural context, though even these efforts face questions about whether certain knowledge should be shared publicly at all, regardless of how respectfully it might be presented. The ethical complexities of even discussing Skinwalkers as we are doing now deserve acknowledgement. Is it appropriate for non-Navajo people to talk about Skinwalkers at all, given the cultural prohibition against such discussion, even among Navajo people? Does presenting this information in educational context that emphasizes respect and cultural understanding justify engaging with material that many Navajo people would prefer remain private? Are we perpetuating harmful dynamics by including Skinwalkers in this survey of Native American demons, potentially encouraging further popular culture appropriation while claiming educational purpose? These questions have no easy answers, and different people, including different Navajo people, hold different positions on what is appropriate regarding public discussion of these beliefs. What remains clear is that for many Navajo people, Skinwalkers represent a real and serious concern, not merely folklore or historical belief, but a present danger that continues to affect their lives, a source of genuine fear and anxiety that cannot be dismissed simply because outsiders find the beliefs difficult to accept. The specific cultural context of these beliefs, their integration into Navajo cosmology and ethics, their connections to deep values about proper human behavior, and the consequences of violating sacred norms, all this makes Skinwalkers meaningful in ways that transcend their function as scary stories or supernatural threats, transforming them into embodiments of the worst possibilities of human nature when spiritual power is perverted to evil purposes. Part 4. Great Plains Demons, Underwater Panthers, Baykok, and Dear Woman across the vast grasslands of the Great Plains, where numerous indigenous nations, including the Lakota, Cheyenne, Pawnee, Blackfoot, and many others, developed cultures adapted to the expansive landscape of prairie and sky, where buffalo herds darkened the horizon and survival depended on successful hunting and the maintenance of proper relationships with the spiritual forces that governed the natural world. Demon beliefs took forms specific to the plains environment and the challenges faced by peoples who lived in close relationship with powerful and sometimes dangerous natural forces. The spiritual worldview of most plains peoples recognized that power pervaded the natural world, that this power was accessible through vision quests and other means, and that spiritual beings of various types interacted constantly with humans. Among these beings were those that Europeans and Americans would classify as demons or monsters, entities whose relationship with humans was predominantly dangerous, whose encounters required specific knowledge and protocols to survive, who served as warnings, tests, or simply as manifestations of natural power in its most threatening forms. One of the most widespread supernatural beings in the beliefs of multiple indigenous nations across the Great Lakes region and extending into the plains was the underwater panther, known by various names in different languages, including Mishipeshu in Ojibwe, Mishipeshu, and other variants. Despite the name suggesting a feline creature, descriptions of underwater panthers varied considerably, but typically described them as composite beings combining features of several animals in ways that emphasized their otherworldly nature and power. Most descriptions included a feline body resembling a mountain lion or lynx, a long tail, often described as scaly or serpentine rather than furred, sometimes with spikes or scales along the spine, and horns or antlers on the head, creating a chimeric being that combined mammalian, reptilian, and sometimes avian elements into a form that existed nowhere in normal nature and therefore clearly belonged to the spiritual realm. Underwater panthers were believed to dwell in lakes and rivers, inhabiting the underwater realm, which in the cosmology of many indigenous nations represented a lower world opposite to the upper world of the sky and thunderbirds, with the Earth's surface being the middle world where humans lived. The underwater panthers served as masters or controllers of the underwater realm, beings of immense power who could cause storms on the water, create dangerous waves and currents, drown people who offended them, or who ventured onto the water without proper respect, or grant power and success to those who approached them correctly and who they favored. This dual nature, capable of being either threatening or beneficial, depending on relationship and circumstance, made underwater panthers complex rather than simply evil, dangerous but not inherently malevolent, powerful forces that required respect and proper protocol rather than simple avoidance. Pictographs and petroglyphs at various sites around the Great Lakes and elsewhere depict beings that scholars identify as underwater panthers, showing their importance in indigenous spiritual thought stretching back centuries or millennia. These rock art images show horned, long-tailed, feline-like creatures, often in association with water or in contexts suggesting spiritual or ceremonial significance. The presence of these images at sacred sites at locations where vision quests might be conducted suggests that underwater panthers played important roles in spiritual practice, and that encounter with them or their images was considered significant and powerful. The relationship between underwater panthers and thunderbirds represented a fundamental cosmic opposition in the worldview of many Great Lakes and Plains peoples. Thunderbirds, enormous birds of the upper world who created thunder with their wing beats and lightning with their eyes, were often understood to be in perpetual conflict with underwater panthers. Their battles, creating storms as thunder and lightning from above, fought against the underwater forces from below, the middle world where humans lived being caught between these cosmic powers and affected by their conflicts. This opposition represented broader dualities between upper and lower, sky and water, different forms of power that needed to be balanced, and humans had to navigate carefully between these forces, honoring both and avoiding becoming too aligned with either, lest they attract hostility from the other. Stories about underwater panthers often emphasize their danger to those who failed to show proper respect or who violated spiritual protocols. A person who boasted excessively about their abilities, who failed to make appropriate offerings before water travel, who polluted or desecrated a lake or river might find themselves targeted by an underwater panther who would stir up a storm, overturn their canoe, drag them beneath the water to drown, or visit them with illness or misfortune that continued until proper amends were made. These cautionary tales reinforced important cultural values about humility, respect for natural forces, proper ritual behavior, and the recognition that human power was limited and had to exist in proper relationship with greater spiritual powers. However, the same beings that could destroy could also empower. Shamans and medicine people sometimes sought relationships with underwater panthers through vision quests or other spiritual practices, attempting to gain access to the underwater power these beings controlled. Success in establishing such a relationship could bring immense shamanic power, the ability to control weather, to heal illness, to see the future, to succeed in warfare, though it also brought great danger, as underwater panther power was volatile and could easily harm the practitioner if not handled correctly, or if the relationship broke down. The pursuit of such power demonstrated courage and spiritual strength, yet also carried risks of spiritual corruption or of becoming too identified with underwater forces in ways that unbalanced the practitioner and brought them into conflict with sky powers. Moving from the water to the forest, another plains and woodland demon was the Baykok, found in the beliefs of the Ojibwe and related Anishinaabe peoples. The Baykok was described as a skeletal being, a flying skeleton warrior who hunted at night, specifically targeting warriors and hunters, though sometimes attacking anyone who ventured into his territory. His appearance emphasized death and predation. A gaunt, skeletal frame covered in tattered skin, carrying a bow and a club with a stone head, moving through the forest with unnatural silence, despite his skeletal form suggesting he should rattle and clatter with every movement. The Baykok's hunting method involved stalking humans through the forests, drawing his bow and firing invisible arrows that caused illness or eventually death, or striking with his stone club if he caught someone, the blows causing wasting illness that slowly killed the victim over time. His invisibility or near invisibility made him especially dangerous, for a person might not know the Baykok was present until the invisible arrow struck, until illness began that resisted normal healing, until it was too late to take protective measures. The only signs of Baykok presence might be a feeling of being watched, an unnatural silence in the forest where normal animal sounds ceased, a cold presence that made the skin crawl, providing minimal warning to those sensitive enough to detect such subtle signs. The Baykok's specific targeting of warriors and hunters made him particularly significant in cultures where hunting prowess and warrior status conferred prestige and social position. In some interpretations, the Baykok represented the spirits of warriors who died unavenged or improperly buried, their anger and frustrated warrior energy transforming them into skeletal predators who killed other warriors to increase their own ghostly war party. In other accounts, the Baykok was simply a type of malevolent spirit, a death-bringing monster whose exact origin was unclear, but whose threat was very real. Either way, the Baykok served as a reminder that even the strongest warriors and most skilled hunters were vulnerable to supernatural attack, that physical prowess provided no protection against spiritual threats, that humility and proper spiritual protection were essential regardless of how capable one might be in the physical realm. Protection against the Baykok involved traditional spiritual defenses, including wearing amulets blessed by medicine people, following proper protocols when hunting or traveling through the forest, avoiding certain areas or times known to be particularly dangerous, and knowing the specific countermeasures that might protect against or drive away the Baykok if one sensed his presence. Medicine people had specific ceremonies for treating someone struck by Baykok's invisible arrows, rituals that attempted to extract the spiritual contamination, causing the illness before it became fatal. Though success was not guaranteed and depended on how quickly treatment began and how powerful the medicine person's spiritual abilities were. Another significant supernatural being from Plains traditions was the Deer Woman, found in the beliefs of multiple nations, including the Ponca, Omaha, Lakota, and others. Deer Woman appeared as a beautiful woman, seductive and alluring, who attracted men to their doom. Her true nature was revealed through her feet, which were deer hooves rather than human feet, though she took care to conceal this telltale sign beneath long skirts or by remaining seated or partially hidden when she encountered potential victims. Men who became entranced by her beauty and followed her or accepted her advances would be led to isolated locations where she would reveal her true supernatural nature and trample them to death with her sharp hooves, or would dance them to death, forcing them to dance endlessly until they collapsed from exhaustion and died, or would lead them to such remote locations that they became lost and perished from exposure or starvation. Deer Woman's targeting of men, particularly young men, and her method of luring them through sexual attraction made her story function as a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of uncontrolled lust, about the risks of abandoning community and propriety to pursue sexual gratification, about the potential consequences of being led by desire rather than judgment. In cultures where sexual behavior was regulated through specific cultural norms, and where maintaining proper relationships and respecting sexual boundaries was important for social cohesion, Deer Woman served as an effective deterrent, warning men that strange women who appeared too attractive, who propositioned too easily, who seemed too good to be true, might be supernatural threats rather than what they appeared. Some interpretations of Deer Woman stories suggest she specifically targeted men who disrespected women, who were predatory in their sexual behavior, who treated women as objects for conquest rather than as full humans deserving respect, making Deer Woman a supernatural enforcer of proper sexual ethics who punished violations of appropriate conduct. In this reading, Deer Woman became a protector of women as much as a threat to men, using her seductive appearance to identify and destroy men whose sexual behavior violated cultural norms, serving social justice through supernatural means. This interpretation transforms what might appear to be a simple monster story into a more complex narrative about gender relations, sexual ethics, and supernatural enforcement of behavioral norms. The way to identify Deer Woman and avoid her trap was to observe carefully, to look for the telltale sign of her hooves, and to remember that anything too perfect was likely supernatural rather than natural. Some traditions suggested that Deer Woman could not maintain her disguise if confronted directly with awareness of her true nature, that calling her out or refusing her advances despite her beauty would cause her to flee or would break whatever power she had over the potential victim. Others suggested that tobacco offerings, properly made, would appease her or cause her to leave without harming the person who made the offering. Tobacco being a sacred substance in many Plains traditions used for spiritual protection and communication with the spirit world. These Great Plains demons, the underwater panthers lurking in lakes and rivers, the skeletal Baykok stalking through forests, the seductive and deadly Deer Woman, each reflected specific concerns and environmental realities of Plains life. Water was precious and powerful in the often arid plains, and the dangers of drowning, of sudden storms, of the power contained in lakes and rivers, all found expression in underwater panther beliefs. The forests that bordered prairie lands contained real dangers from predators and from becoming lost, dangers personified in the Baykok. Sexual norms and the potential for men's behavior toward women to become destructive found supernatural expression in Deer Woman. In each case, the demon belief encoded practical wisdom in memorable supernatural form, using the power of fear and wonder to transmit cultural values and survival information across generations. The persistence of these beliefs among contemporary Plains peoples varies, with some individuals and communities maintaining traditional stories and beliefs, while others have lost these traditions through the disruptions of colonization, forced assimilation, language loss, and cultural change. Efforts to revitalize Plains cultures in recent decades have included recovering and teaching traditional stories, including those about supernatural beings, recognizing these narratives as important cultural heritage that deserves preservation and transmission to new generations. The stories are understood as belonging to specific nations and communities, not as generic Native American tales. And contemporary Indigenous storytellers emphasize the importance of learning these traditions within their proper cultural contexts, rather than through simplified or appropriated versions. Part 5. Southeastern Demons, Stikini, Raven Mockers, Uktena. In the lush forests and river valleys of the American Southeast, where the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and numerous other indigenous nations developed complex agricultural societies with sophisticated spiritual traditions, demon beliefs reflected the specific environment and cultural concerns of peoples who lived in densely forested landscapes rich with biodiversity. where the boundary between human settlements and wild nature was constantly negotiated, where the humid climate and abundant life created environments that nurtured both sustenance and danger in equal measure. The spiritual worldviews of southeastern peoples recognized a complex cosmos inhabited by numerous spiritual beings, with elaborate mythologies explaining the origins of the world, the proper relationships between humans and animals and plants, and the various supernatural entities that influenced human affairs. Among these beings were those whose relationship with humans was predominantly threatening, spirits and monsters whose encounters brought illness, death, or spiritual corruption, whose existence served as warnings, and whose stories encoded important cultural knowledge about proper behavior and the consequences of transgression. The Stikini in owl form would fly to the homes of intended victims, peering through windows, seeking entry, attempting to reach sleeping people whose hearts they craved. If successful in entering a dwelling and reaching a sleeping victim, the Stikini would use supernatural means to extract the person's heart, consuming it to gain power and extend their own life, the victim dying from the loss or falling into a wasting illness that killed them slowly. The morning after such an attack, the Stikini would return to where they had hidden their organs, re-ingesting their digestive system in another grotesque reversal, returning to fully human form to walk among their community as if nothing had occurred, their nocturnal predation hidden behind a normal appearance. The identification of a Stikini was difficult, but not impossible. Someone who was suspected of being a Stikini might be observed for characteristic signs: unusual behavior around owls, possession of owl feathers or other suspicious items, unexplained absences during nights when attacks occurred, or they might exhibit signs of having recently regurgitated, such as distinctive breath or physical weakness. If a community became convinced that someone was a Stikini, traditional justice could be harsh, with execution sometimes considered necessary to protect others from ongoing attacks, the witch being killed and their body treated in specific ways to prevent them from returning or transforming after death. The owl form of the Stikini connected to broader patterns in Indigenous American beliefs, where owls were often associated with death, witchcraft, and bad omens. Unlike in European traditions, where owls might represent wisdom, in many Native American cultures, the owl's nocturnal habits, silent flight, eerie calls, and association with darkness made them birds of ill omen. Their presence near homes, or their calls heard at night, interpreted as warnings of impending death or as indicators of witchcraft activity. The Stikini belief thus drew on and reinforced these existing associations, explaining why owls near homes were frightening and providing specific supernatural threat that owl presence might indicate. Moving to Cherokee traditions from the Appalachian Mountains and surrounding territories, we encounter the raven mockers, another form of witch that in some ways paralleled the Stikini, but with distinct characteristics specific to Cherokee culture. The raven mockers, called Kalona Ayaliski in Cherokee, were witches who possessed the power to transform into ravens, or who traveled in spirit form as ravens, flying through the night to the homes of sick or dying people to steal their remaining life force, hastening their death and adding the stolen years to the witch's own lifespan. The raven mockers' specific targeting of the sick and dying revealed a particular cruelty, for rather than attacking the healthy and strong, these witches preyed upon those already vulnerable, those fighting illness or injury. those whose families kept vigil hoping for recovery, the Raven Mocker would arrive in invisible spirit form, perceptible only to medicine people, with the power to see spiritual entities, and would torment the sick person, frightening them, weakening them further, eventually removing their heart to consume it and steal whatever life remained in the victim. The death that followed a Raven Mocker attack might appear natural, the person succumbing to their existing illness, but medicine people could identify the telltale signs of Raven Mocker involvement and might attempt to drive them away before death occurred. The sound of a raven or crow calling at night, particularly near a home where someone lay ill, was interpreted as a potential sign of Raven Mocker presence, the witch announcing their approach or circling the home seeking entry. Families with sick members might increase their vigilance when such sounds were heard, might call upon medicine people to provide protection, might take specific measures to ward off the supernatural threat. The vulnerability of the sick unable to defend themselves and already fighting for survival made Raven Mocker attacks particularly feared and particularly tragic when successful. Cherokee medicine people had specific ceremonies and powers that could be used against Raven Mockers. A powerful medicine person might be able to see the approaching Raven Mocker in spirit form and could engage in spiritual combat to drive them away, protecting the sick person from supernatural attack while physical healing was attempted. Some medicine people possessed the power to identify Raven Mockers in their human form, seeing through their disguise to recognize the witch beneath, though revealing such knowledge was dangerous, as Raven Mockers would attempt to kill anyone who threatened to expose them. The fate of exposed Raven Mockers varied in different accounts. Some traditions held that they would die immediately once their identity was publicly revealed, their stolen life force abandoning them and causing rapid death. Other accounts suggested they needed to be killed by the community to end their threat, and that their bodies required specific treatment to prevent them from returning or continuing to cause harm after death. The difficulty of identifying Raven Mockers and the danger of making false accusations meant that communities had to be certain before taking action, creating tensions between the need to protect against witchcraft and the risk of unjustly accusing innocent people. Another significant supernatural being in Cherokee tradition was the Uktena, an enormous serpent with horns and a diamond-shaped crystal embedded in its forehead, a being of immense power that inhabited the deep pools and remote mountains of Cherokee territory. The Uktena was described as massive, its body thick as a tree trunk and impossibly long, its scales gleaming, its horns like those of a deer, but much larger, and most importantly, the crystal in its forehead that glowed with inner light, a gem called the Yee Naaldlooshii that possessed tremendous magical power and was intensely sought after by medicine people despite the extreme danger of attempting to acquire it. The Uktena's gaze was deadly, looking directly into its eyes, particularly the crystal that adorned its forehead, would result in death, the victim struck dead instantly, or falling into a coma from which they would never wake. The power of the crystal too intense for humans to endure without proper spiritual protection. The Uktena's breath was poisonous, creating a miasma around it that sickened or killed anyone who came too close without protection. The area around an Uktena's lair would show signs of its presence, plants withering, animals avoiding the location, an atmosphere of danger and power that warned the sensitive to stay away. Despite these extreme dangers, or perhaps because of them, the Ulunsuti crystal was intensely valuable for spiritual purposes. A medicine person who possessed one of these crystals gained tremendous power, the ability to see the future, to locate lost objects or people, to diagnose illness, to curse enemies, the crystal serving as a supreme tool of spiritual power that amplified the medicine person's existing abilities. However, the crystal was also dangerous to its possessor, requiring regular feeding with animal blood to maintain it and to prevent it from turning its power against its owner, and requiring specific protocols for handling and storage to avoid accidents. The crystal had a will of its own in some sense, and maintaining proper relationship with it required constant attention and respect. The acquisition of an Ulunsuti required either extreme bravery and powerful medicine, a hero or medicine person attempting the dangerous task of killing an Uktena and removing its crystal, or fortunate discovery of a crystal from an Uktena that had died naturally. An extremely rare occurrence that gave the finder tremendous advantage without requiring them to face the living monster. Stories of heroes attempting to kill Uktena described elaborate preparations, spiritual purification, the creation of protective barriers, and specific attack methods that might allow the hero to strike without looking directly at the crystal or being killed by the serpent's other defenses. The successful killing and crystal extraction representing a supreme achievement that brought both great power and great danger to the victor. The Uktena in Cherokee cosmology represented concentrated natural power in its most dangerous and most valuable form. A being that was neither good nor evil, but simply extremely powerful, capable of killing easily, yet also capable of empowering those brave and skilled enough to claim its crystal. The serpent's association with deep water and remote mountains, liminal spaces at the edges of human territory, emphasized its position between the human and spirit worlds, a creature that belonged to both, yet fully inhabited neither, dangerous to encounter, yet essential for those seeking the highest levels of spiritual power. Southeastern beliefs also included various other dangerous beings specific to particular nations or regions. The Creek tradition spoke of the tie snake, a water serpent that created whirlpools to drown people or pulled them beneath the water. The Choctaw feared the Nalusafalaya, a shadow-like being that could drive people mad or warn them of impending death. The Chickasaw spoke of various shape-shifting witches and spirits that inhabited the forests and waterways of their territory. Each nation maintained its own specific traditions while sharing certain common themes with neighboring peoples, creating a rich tapestry of supernatural beliefs adapted to local environments and cultural needs. The Southeastern people's experience of colonization, including the devastating policies of Indian removal in the 1830s that forcibly displaced most Southeastern nations to Indian territory in present-day Oklahoma, in what the Cherokee call the Trail of Tears, and other nations remember with similar trauma, severely disrupted traditional cultural transmission, including spiritual beliefs and stories. Many spiritual traditions were lost or fragmented during this period of extreme upheaval, suffering, and death. However, Southeastern nations have maintained significant aspects of their traditional cultures, including beliefs about supernatural beings and contemporary Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, and other peoples continue to tell traditional stories, to practice traditional spirituality where knowledge has been preserved, and to work to recover and revitalize traditions that were interrupted or suppressed. The demon beliefs of the Southeast, the owl witches who consumed hearts, the raven mockers who stole life from the dying, the tremendous horned serpents who guarded crystals of power, all reflected the specific spiritual ecology of the region and the cultural concerns of peoples who had developed sophisticated societies in the abundant but also dangerous environment of the southeastern woodlands, where life flourished but death was never far away, where power could be accessed but always at significant risk, where the most valuable spiritual gifts required facing the greatest dangers. Part 6. Pacific Northwest and Western Demons. Along the Pacific coast, from present-day Alaska through British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, where numerous indigenous nations, including the Tlingit, Haida, Kwakwaka, Wakwa, Salish, Chinook, and many others developed complex maritime cultures based on salmon fishing, whale hunting, and elaborate artistic and ceremonial traditions. Supernatural beliefs reflected the specific environmental and cultural realities of peoples who lived between the forest and the sea, who drew sustenance from both realms, and who recognized spiritual power in the dramatic landscapes of towering cedars, rocky coastlines, and waters teeming with life. Pacific Northwest cosmologies generally recognized a world populated by numerous spiritual beings, with humans, animals, and spirits existing in a complex network of relationships that required proper protocols and reciprocity to maintain. The boundary between human and animal, between physical and spiritual, was understood to be permeable, with beings capable of transformation between forms, with animals possessing their own societies and cultures parallel to human ones, with supernatural entities intervening constantly in human affairs. Among these many beings were those whose relationship with humans was predominantly threatening, spirits and monsters whose encounters brought danger, whose stories warned about proper behavior, and whose existence reflected the very real hazards of life in environments where the ocean could kill through storms or drowning, where the forest contained dangerous predators, and where winter brought cold and darkness that tested human endurance. Among the Coast Salish peoples of the Pacific Northwest, traditional stories spoke of Basket Woman, or Basket Ogress, a giant cannibalistic woman who carried an enormous basket on her back in which she collected children that she captured to carry home and eat. Basket Woman was described as enormously tall, her size allowing her to stride across great distances rapidly, her strength such that she could easily capture multiple children at once, her basket large enough to hold many victims. Her appearance was terrifying, with wild hair, sharp teeth, and a generally monstrous countenance that frightened anyone who saw her, though children were her primary prey. Basket Woman hunted by approaching villages or traveling areas where children might play unsupervised, using her speed and size to snatch up children before they could flee, stuffing them into her basket, which was secured on her back, and then retreating to her lair in the deep forest or mountains, where she would consume her captives. The stories emphasized the swiftness of her attacks, how quickly children could be taken if they wandered away from safe areas or failed to heed warnings about dangerous places or times. Parents used basket woman stories to reinforce lessons about staying close to home, not wandering into the forest alone, remaining near adults who could protect them, encoding practical safety lessons in memorable supernatural narrative. However, basket woman stories also frequently included elements of successful resistance or escape. In many versions, a clever child or children managed to escape from the basket while basket woman was traveling, cutting a hole in the bottom of the basket and dropping out, or finding other means to free themselves while the ogress was distracted. Other versions featured heroes or protective spirits who tracked down basket woman, fought her, killed her, and rescued the captured children, returning them safely to their families. These escape and rescue narratives transformed basket woman from simple terror into a threat that could be overcome through cleverness, bravery, or community action, providing hopeful elements alongside the fear, and teaching that even great dangers might be survivable with wit and courage. The psychological and social functions of basket woman beliefs extended beyond simple child safety lessons. The image of the enormous woman with her basket represented several cultural anxieties and concerns. At a practical level, the story warned about real dangers to children, including predatory animals, hazardous terrain, and getting lost in the vast forests where they might die from exposure or injury. At a social level, the story reinforced parental authority and children's obligation to obey safety rules, using supernatural fear to back up parental warnings that children might otherwise ignore. At a deeper level, basket woman might represent fears about female power when not properly channeled. The monstrous feminine maternal instincts gone wrong, nurturing transformed into consuming, the basket that should carry gathered foods instead carrying stolen children. Moving to beliefs found among various Plateau and some Pacific Northwest peoples, we encounter the owl witch or owl woman. Similar in some ways to the Stikini of the Southeast, but with distinctive regional characteristics. The owl witch was a shape-shifting supernatural being or human witch who could transform into owl form, typically a great horned owl, to fly at night engaging in malevolent activities, including spying on people, stealing children, spreading disease, and engaging in various forms of spiritual attack. Unlike some benevolent shapeshifters in Indigenous American traditions, the owl witch was specifically associated with harmful magic, with witchcraft in its negative sense, with the use of spiritual power for antisocial purposes. The owl witch's nocturnal activities included flying to people's homes to peer through smoke holes or windows, observing private activities, and conversations to gather information that could be used for malicious purposes, creating psychological terror as people realized their privacy could be invaded by supernatural surveillance. The witch in owl form might also attempt to steal small children who were left unattended, carrying them off to unknown fates, or might use the opportunity of nighttime transformation to place curses, blow harmful substances into homes, or engage in other forms of spiritual attack that would manifest as illness, bad luck, or misfortune for the targeted family. Protection against owl witches involved both preventive and reactive measures. Protective amulets and sacred objects blessed by spiritual leaders could be placed around homes to prevent owl witches from entering or to alert occupants to their presence. Certain songs and prayers specific to each tradition could be sung to drive away owl witches or to protect children from being stolen. If owl sounds were heard unusually close to homes or during times interpreted as suspicious, families might take specific actions, including waking all household members, checking on children, making noise to drive away the presence, or calling upon a spiritual leader to provide more powerful protection. In some traditions, the owl witch could be injured or killed while in owl form, and such an injury would be visible on the witch's human body when they return to human form, providing proof of their identity and justifying community action against them. Stories of successful defense against owl witches described brave individuals managing to wound the attacking owl, then the next morning discovering that a specific person in the community had matching injuries despite claiming they had been home all night, their injuries revealing their secret identity as the owl witch. Such exposure would typically lead to the witch being driven from the community, killed, or forced to undergo purification ceremonies if the community chose to give them opportunity for redemption rather than immediate punishment. The western regions of indigenous North America, including California, the Great Basin, and the Plateau areas, hosted numerous specific traditions about dangerous supernatural beings adapted to their particular environments. The Paiute peoples spoke of cannibalistic giants that inhabited the mountains and deserts. Various California nations, including the Yokuts and others, maintained traditions about harmful water spirits, mountain spirits, and various shapeshifters. The harsh environments of the Great Basin with its extreme temperatures and scarce water sources generated beliefs about spirits associated with these environmental dangers. Supernatural explanations for the very real risks of life in challenging landscapes. California's indigenous peoples, among the most diverse in North America, linguistically and culturally, developed correspondingly diverse supernatural beliefs. Many California traditions included beliefs about what anthropologists call bear shamans or bear doctors, individuals who possess the power to transform into bears or to assume bear-like strength and ferocity, using this power sometimes for community benefit as powerful defenders or healers, but also potentially using it for harmful purposes as witch bears who attacked enemies or spread terror. The bear person concept reflected the importance of bears in California indigenous cultures, the power and danger these animals represented, and the idea that spiritual practitioners might access or embody that power. Some California traditions spoke specifically of rock babies or mountain babies, small supernatural beings that inhabited rocky areas and mountains and whose cries resembled those of human infants, luring people to search for the source of the crying and leading them into dangerous terrain where they might fall, become lost, or otherwise meet harm. These beliefs served practical functions by warning people to be cautious when exploring unfamiliar mountainous areas, to not blindly follow sounds that might lead them into danger, encoding survival wisdom about the hazards of rough terrain in supernatural form. The Chinook people of the Columbia River region maintained traditions about various spirits associated with the powerful river that was central to their territory and culture. Among these was the spirit of the Cascades Rapids, one of the most dangerous sections of the Columbia, where many people drowned over the centuries. The churning water and complex currents creating hazards that claimed lives regularly. This spirit required propitiation and respect from those who needed to navigate the rapids, offerings made before attempting passage, proper protocols followed to minimize the supernatural danger that accompanied the very real physical danger of the treacherous water. Pacific Northwest peoples also maintained elaborate traditions about the Kushtaka or land otter people found in Tlingit and related traditions of Southeast Alaska. These beings appeared as otters or could transform into human-like form, inhabiting the forests and shorelines, luring humans, particularly children, to the water, where they would transform the captured humans into creatures like themselves, neither fully human nor fully animal, trapped in an in-between state. Kushtaka were feared because they specifically targeted humans for transformation, and because those who were taken became fundamentally changed, unable to return to their families or former lives, lost to the human world and absorbed into the supernatural otter society. The prevention of Kushtaka capture involved teaching children to avoid certain areas, to never approach strange people or animals near the water, to immediately report any unusual encounters to adults. Those who were lost or at risk of capture might be saved if found quickly enough by rescue parties who could identify the signs of Kushtaka activity and who knew the proper procedures for reclaiming someone before the transformation became permanent. The stories served multiple practical functions, including reinforcing water safety for children living in communities where drowning was a real constant danger, warning about the risks of becoming separated from the group in the wilderness, and providing narrative framework for understanding the occasional disappearances that occurred in coastal communities. Across all these Pacific Northwest and Western traditions, we see common themes emerging. Demon beliefs adapted to specific environmental challenges, supernatural beings that reflected the particular dangers of each region, stories that warned about real hazards, while also addressing deeper psychological and cultural concerns. The ocean peoples feared water spirits and coastal monsters because drowning and storms claimed lives regularly. Forest peoples feared beings that lurked in the vast cedar forests where it was easy to become lost. Desert peoples feared spirits associated with heat, thirst, and the harshness of their environment. Each tradition demonstrated sophisticated adaptation of supernatural beliefs to practical needs, using spiritual narrative to transmit survival knowledge, to reinforce community cohesion, to provide explanatory frameworks for tragedy and loss. The colonial experience in the Pacific Northwest and West Coast regions brought tremendous disruption to indigenous populations, including the usual devastating impacts of disease, land theft, cultural suppression, and forced assimilation. However, many Pacific Northwest nations maintain relatively strong cultural continuity compared to some other regions, and traditional practices, including storytelling, ceremony, and spiritual beliefs about supernatural beings, continue to be transmitted across generations. Despite colonial pressures, the tremendous artistic traditions of Pacific Northwest peoples, including totem poles, masks, and other ceremonial regalia that often depicted supernatural beings, including dangerous spirits and monsters, provided additional means of cultural transmission that survived even when oral traditions were interrupted. Contemporary Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples continue to practice traditional spirituality, to tell traditional stories, including those about dangerous, supernatural beings, and to work actively to preserve and revitalize traditions that were suppressed or endangered during the colonial period. the stories of basket women, owl witches, kushtaka, and other supernatural beings remain important cultural heritage, taught to new generations, adapted to address contemporary concerns while maintaining core traditional meanings, demonstrating the continued vitality and relevance of indigenous spiritual traditions in the modern world. Part 7. Cultural Context, Functions, and Modern Perspectives. Having surveyed specific demon beliefs from various regions and nations across indigenous North America, from the cannibalistic Wendigo of the northern forests to the shape-shifting Skinwalkers of the southwest deserts, from the heart-eating witches of the southeast to the child-stealing monsters of the Pacific Northwest, we must now step back to examine the broader cultural contexts within which these beliefs functioned, the common patterns and important variations between traditions, the purposes these supernatural narratives served within indigenous societies, and the complex questions about how these traditions are understood, practiced, and challenged in the contemporary world. The first essential recognition is that Native American demon beliefs, like indigenous spiritual traditions, more broadly, were and are intimately connected to specific places, to particular landscapes and environments, to the territories where each nation developed its unique culture over centuries or millennia of continuous occupation and adaptation. The Wendigo makes sense in the context of the boreal forest, where winter starvation was a recurring reality, where the question of whether to engage in cannibalism to survive was not purely theoretical, but a genuine moral dilemma that some people actually faced. The underwater Panthers make sense in regions dominated by the Great Lakes, where water was simultaneously source of life through fish and transportation, and source of death through storms and drowning. The demons and monsters of each region reflected the specific challenges and dangers of those environments, encoding practical knowledge about survival in forms that were memorable and emotionally powerful. This place-based nature of indigenous spiritual beliefs raises important questions about the appropriateness of discussing these traditions outside their original contexts, about what happens when stories that belong to specific places and peoples are abstracted from those contexts and presented to general audiences. When we tell stories about the Wendigo, without situating them within Algonquian territory and culture, without acknowledging the specific environmental and social contexts that gave these beliefs meaning, do we transform sacred or important cultural knowledge into mere entertainment? Do we contribute to the ongoing colonial process of extracting value from indigenous cultures while giving nothing back to the communities from whom these traditions originate? These ethical questions have no simple answers, but they deserve acknowledgement and serious consideration. A second key recognition is that Native American demon beliefs generally functioned within broader systems of spiritual and ethical teaching, not as isolated monster stories, but as part of comprehensive worldviews that explained existence, prescribed proper behavior, and provided frameworks for understanding human experience. The Wendigo was not just a scary monster, but an embodiment of the consequences of breaking the most fundamental taboo, a warning about how isolation and desperation could corrupt human nature, a reminder of why community and sharing were essential for survival. The Skinwalker represented the ultimate betrayal of kinship obligations, showing what humans might become if they completely rejected the social bonds and ethical commitments that made them human. Deer Woman warned about the dangers of uncontrolled lust and taught proper sexual ethics. Basket Woman reinforced parental authority and child safety lessons. Understanding these educational and ethical functions reveals that what Europeans might have dismissed as primitive superstition actually represented sophisticated pedagogical techniques using narrative and supernatural imagery to transmit complex knowledge about survival, social relationships, proper behavior, and the consequences of transgression. The demons served as vivid, memorable symbols that could communicate important lessons more effectively than simple factual instruction, creating emotional associations that reinforced proper behavior through fear of supernatural consequences, while also explaining why certain behaviors were dangerous or prohibited. Modern psychology recognizes that humans learn moral and social behavior partially through narratives that create emotional engagement, and indigenous demon stories demonstrate this principle in action, creating powerful teaching tools that operated across generations. The role of fear in these traditions deserves careful consideration. Western observers, particularly during periods of most active colonialism and missionization, often characterized indigenous spiritual beliefs as fear-based, as people living in constant terror of malevolent spirits, as religions of dread that needed to be replaced with supposedly more benevolent Christian alternatives. This characterization was both inaccurate and self-serving, misrepresenting indigenous beliefs to justify cultural destruction, while ignoring how Christian traditions also used supernatural fear, particularly threats of hell and demons, to enforce behavioral compliance. In reality, while indigenous demon beliefs certainly incorporated fear as one emotional response, they existed within broader spiritual systems that also included love, awe, gratitude, joy, and other emotions. That recognized beneficial spiritual beings alongside dangerous ones, and that understood fear as an appropriate and useful response to genuine dangers, whether natural or supernatural. The fear generated by beliefs about dangerous spiritual beings served practical purposes. Fear of the Wendigo reinforced the absolute prohibition against cannibalism and encouraged food sharing and community support during winter. Fear of skinwalkers reinforced proper social behavior and respect for sacred protocols. Fear of water spirits encouraged appropriate caution around lakes and rivers. Fear of child-stealing monsters kept children from wandering into dangerous areas unsupervised. In each case, supernatural fear backed up practical wisdom, creating strong motivation to follow survival guidelines and behavioral norms. Serving community well-being, even as it generated anxiety for individuals who transgressed or who feared they might be targeted by malevolent forces. However, indigenous spiritual systems also provided means of managing and mitigating these fears. The same traditions that included demons and monsters also included protective ceremonies, healing rituals, spiritual leaders who could combat supernatural threats, knowledge about how to avoid or defend against dangerous beings, and ultimately, frameworks for understanding that, while dangers existed, humans were not helpless victims, but possessed agency and spiritual resources to maintain safety. The medicine people, shamans, spiritual leaders who held specialized knowledge about dealing with supernatural dangers served essential roles within their communities, providing protection and healing, maintaining balance, addressing spiritual threats, giving community members confidence that while demons were real, defense against them was also real and available. The question of belief, of what indigenous peoples literally believed versus what they understood metaphorically or symbolically, proves complex and probably unanswerable in simple terms. Certainly many indigenous people, both historically and contemporarily, have believed or do believe, quite literally, in the existence of the specific supernatural beings their traditions describe, understanding them as real entities that can actually appear and cause harm. These literal believers take appropriate precautions, follow prescribed protocols, and interpret experiences through frameworks that accept supernatural causation. Other indigenous people, perhaps influenced by Western education or by personal skepticism, might understand these traditions more metaphorically, seeing the demon stories as encoding truth about human psychology and behavior without requiring belief in literal supernatural beings. Still others occupy positions between or beyond these alternatives, maintaining complex relationships to traditional beliefs that don't easily map onto Western categories of literal versus metaphorical. The colonial experience profoundly affected Native American demon beliefs as it affected all aspects of indigenous cultures. Christian missionaries specifically targeted indigenous spiritual beliefs as pagan superstition, or worse, as demonic, with some missionaries reinterpreting native spiritual beings as manifestations of Satan and his demons, attempting to convince indigenous peoples that their traditional practices involved evil forces that needed to be abandoned. This missionary activity met varying degrees of success depending on numerous factors, including the specific circumstances of contact, the level of force or coercion involved, the attractiveness or persuasiveness of Christian alternatives, and the resilience of indigenous communities and their traditional beliefs. In some cases, indigenous peoples abandoned or modified traditional beliefs in response to Christian influence, sometimes voluntarily adopting Christianity, sometimes being forced to suppress traditional practices while maintaining them secretly, sometimes developing syncretic beliefs that combined elements of both traditions in creative synthesis. In other cases, indigenous peoples maintained traditional beliefs despite missionary pressure, or returned to traditional spirituality after periods of forced Christianization, or actively resisted Christian influence and defended traditional practices against colonial attempts at suppression. The diversity of responses reflected the diversity of indigenous peoples themselves and the varying circumstances under which colonization occurred. The United States government's policies toward indigenous religions varied over time, but generally sought to suppress traditional practices until the late 20th century. The federal boarding school system, which forcibly removed indigenous children from their families and attempted to assimilate them into mainstream American society, specifically targeted spiritual practices and stories, punishing children who spoke about traditional beliefs or who maintained cultural practices. This aggressive suppression interrupted cultural transmission across entire generations, creating situations where elders who maintained traditional knowledge died before they could pass it on to younger people who had been prevented from learning during their childhoods. The resulting loss of cultural knowledge, including traditional stories and spiritual beliefs, represented a profound tragedy, a form of cultural genocide that continues to impact indigenous communities today. However, the narrative of complete loss would be inaccurate and would ignore the remarkable resilience of indigenous peoples and their determination to maintain and revitalize traditional cultures. Throughout the colonial period, many indigenous people maintained traditional practices despite official suppression, passing on knowledge secretly, keeping ceremonies and stories alive through periods of intense pressure, ensuring that when conditions changed and traditional practices became safer, the knowledge needed for cultural continuity still existed. Beginning in the mid-20th century and accelerating after the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 and related legislative and legal changes, indigenous peoples have increasingly been able to openly practice traditional spirituality, to teach traditional stories and beliefs, to revitalize cultural practices that had been suppressed or interrupted. Contemporary indigenous communities hold diverse perspectives on their traditional demon beliefs. Some communities maintain these beliefs as living spiritual traditions, continuing to tell the stories, to take seriously the warnings and teachings they contain, to interpret contemporary experiences through traditional frameworks that include the possibility of supernatural causation and spiritual threats. Other communities approach these traditions primarily as cultural heritage, as important stories that deserve preservation and transmission, but that might be understood symbolically or historically rather than as literal truths about supernatural entities. Still, other communities fall somewhere between these positions, with individuals holding varying levels of belief while agreeing on the cultural importance of maintaining traditions, regardless of questions about their literal truth. The revitalization of indigenous cultures in recent decades has included recovery efforts aimed at traditional demon beliefs and stories, along with other aspects of spiritual traditions. Elders who maintain traditional knowledge work to teach younger generations. Linguists and community members collaborate to preserve stories in indigenous languages. Publications and educational programs make traditional narratives available to wider audiences. However, these revitalization efforts also generate debates about what knowledge should be shared publicly, about the risks of making sacred or dangerous knowledge too widely available, about the balance between cultural preservation through documentation and protection of sensitive traditions through restriction. These debates reflect ongoing negotiations about cultural boundaries, about who has the right to know and share certain knowledge, about how to maintain cultural traditions in a contemporary world that operates according to very different principles than traditional indigenous societies. The appropriation of Native American spiritual beliefs, including demon stories by non-Native people, represents an ongoing source of conflict and pain for many indigenous peoples. The New Age movement's adoption of what adherents claim are Native American spiritual practices, the commercial sale of ceremonies and sacred knowledge, the creation of inaccurate or invented Native American traditions that bear little relationship to actual indigenous beliefs, the use of indigenous imagery and stories in popular culture entertainment without permission or compensation. All these represent forms of cultural appropriation that many Native people view as continuation of colonial theft, taking yet more from peoples who have already had so much stolen. The specific case of Wendigo and Skinwalker stories appearing in horror movies, video games, and other commercial entertainment illustrates these tensions. Often, these popular culture representations bear minimal resemblance to actual indigenous beliefs. Stripping the beings of cultural context, altering their characteristics to fit horror genre conventions, using them as generic monsters while claiming Native American authenticity. Some non-native creators have profited significantly from these appropriations, while the indigenous communities from whom the traditions originated received nothing and saw their sacred or important stories reduced to entertainment and often badly misrepresented. Some native people have called for boycotts of such appropriative media and have advocated for legal or ethical restrictions on non-native use of indigenous cultural property. However, other indigenous people have taken different approaches, working to create their own representations of traditional stories, including demon beliefs, attempting to reclaim these narratives by telling them authentically within proper cultural contexts, using modern media forms like film, literature, and digital storytelling to reach contemporary audiences while maintaining cultural integrity. These reclamation efforts seek to ensure that indigenous voices remain central to how indigenous traditions are understood, and that accurate cultural knowledge becomes available as alternative to appropriated and distorted versions, and that indigenous creators rather than outsiders benefit economically and culturally from the sharing of traditional knowledge. The academic study of Native American demon beliefs raises additional ethical questions. Anthropologists and folklorists have documented indigenous traditions, including beliefs about supernatural beings, since the late 19th century, creating archives of information that in many cases preserve knowledge that might otherwise have been completely lost due to cultural disruption. However, this academic documentation occurred within colonial power structures, often involved problematic researcher-subject relationships, sometimes preserved information that indigenous peoples would have preferred to keep private, and created situations where non-native academics became recognized as experts on indigenous traditions, while indigenous knowledge keepers were ignored or marginalized. Contemporary scholarship increasingly recognizes these problems and seeks to decolonize research practices by centering indigenous voices, by conducting research in partnership with indigenous communities rather than merely studying them, by recognizing indigenous peoples as the primary authorities on their own traditions, and by ensuring that research benefits indigenous communities rather than merely advancing academic careers. The question of what role non-indigenous peoples should have in relation to Native American demon beliefs and stories remains contentious and unresolved. Some argue for complete restriction, maintaining that these are indigenous cultural property that outsiders have no right to use, discuss, or teach, regardless of their intentions or how respectfully they might approach the material. Others advocate for respectful engagement that acknowledges sources, admits limitations, avoids appropriation, and ideally occurs in partnership with or with permission from relevant indigenous communities. Still others suggest that cultural exchange and learning are inevitable and potentially beneficial if conducted ethically, that complete restriction serves no one's interests, and that the goal should be ensuring that engagement with indigenous traditions occurs in ways that benefit indigenous peoples and that counter rather than perpetuate colonial dynamics. These debates reflect broader questions about cultural ownership, intellectual property, the ethics of cross-cultural learning, and how society should navigate the legacy of colonialism in addressing whose knowledge belongs to whom and who has rights to share or profit from that knowledge. The specific case of Native American demon beliefs sits within these larger discussions, illustrating the complexities without providing easy resolutions, demanding that we think carefully about our purposes and methods when we engage with indigenous traditions, and requiring that we acknowledge the very real harms that have resulted from centuries of appropriation and misrepresentation, while also recognizing the legitimate interests that people of all backgrounds might have in understanding and appreciating the sophisticated, spiritual traditions that indigenous peoples developed. What we can say with confidence is that Native American demon beliefs represent far more than simple, scary stories or primitive superstition, that they embody sophisticated cultural knowledge about psychology, ethics, social relationships, and survival, that they demonstrate the creativity and wisdom of indigenous peoples who developed these traditions, and that they deserve respectful engagement that acknowledges their origins, honors the cultures from which they come, and recognizes them as belonging to living peoples who continue to find meaning and value in traditions that stretch back for generations beyond counting. Part 8. Conclusion. We have journeyed across the vast expanse of indigenous North America, from the frozen forests where the Wendigo hunted during winter darkness, to the southwestern deserts where Skinwalkers transformed under starlight, from the southeastern woodlands where raven mockers stalked the dying, to the Pacific coast where basket women lurked at the edge of villages, encountering dozens of specific demon beliefs, and exploring the complex cultural contexts within which these traditions functioned. This journey has revealed not a unified Native American demonology, but rather hundreds of distinct traditions, each adapted to specific environments and cultural needs, each reflecting the wisdom and creativity of the people who developed and maintained these beliefs across generations. The demons and monsters we have encountered served multiple functions within their original cultural contexts, far beyond simply frightening people or explaining misfortune through supernatural agency. They encoded survival knowledge in memorable form, warning about real environmental dangers through supernatural narrative, teaching children and adults alike about the hazards of specific places and times. They reinforced social norms and ethical behavior, creating powerful motivations to follow cultural rules and community expectations, demonstrating through vivid example the consequences that awaited those who transgressed fundamental boundaries. They provided frameworks for understanding suffering and tragedy, transforming inexplicable misfortune into comprehensible spiritual attack that could potentially be defended against, giving people sense of agency and control in situations that might otherwise generate helplessness and despair. The demons also revealed what each culture valued and feared most fundamentally. The Wendigo's embodiment of cannibalistic transformation showed how deeply Algonquian peoples valued community and sharing, how completely they rejected the individualism that would allow one person to survive by consuming others. The Skinwalkers' origin through murdering kin demonstrated Navajo commitment to family bonds, and the understanding that anyone who would destroy these bonds had abandoned humanity itself. The underwater Panthers' dual nature as both dangerous and empowering showed how many indigenous cultures recognized that power was not inherently good or evil, but neutral, to be respected and approached correctly, whether one sought protection or empowerment. The child-stealing monsters from various traditions revealed universal parental fears about losing children to dangers that lurked beyond protective boundaries, common patterns emerged across diverse demon beliefs, despite the tremendous variation between specific traditions. Many demon beliefs involved shape-shifting, transformation between human and animal or spirit forms, reflecting broader indigenous understandings that the boundaries between different types of beings were permeable rather than absolute. Many demons were associated with liminal spaces and times, with twilight and night, with boundaries between forest and settlement or water and land, with transitional states where normal rules were suspended and danger increased. Many demons arose from human transgression, either being humans who had transformed through violating taboos or being supernatural beings who punished violations, emphasizing that proper behavior provided some protection while transgression brought danger. Many traditions included both protective knowledge about avoiding demons and active defenses against them, recognizing humans as not helpless before supernatural threats, but possessed of agency and spiritual resources. Yet alongside these commonalities, the tremendous diversity of Native American demon beliefs demands acknowledgement and respect. There is no single indigenous perspective on evil, on supernatural threats, on the nature of dangerous spiritual beings. The hundreds of distinct indigenous nations each developed unique traditions, and treating these as interchangeable or as representing a unified Native American worldview does violence to the reality of indigenous diversity and implicitly continues colonial dynamics that sought to erase specific identities in favor of homogenizing stereotypes. The Ojibwe Wendigo and the Seminole Stikini may share certain broad characteristics as cannibalistic supernatural threats, but they arise from very different cultural contexts, carry different specific meanings, and belong to distinct peoples who deserve recognition as such. The contemporary status of these demon beliefs varies tremendously across different indigenous communities and individuals, ranging from literal belief in the existence and continued activity of these supernatural beings to skeptical or metaphorical interpretations, to positions that combine elements of both or that resist easy categorization. What remains consistent across these varying positions is recognition that the traditional stories carry cultural value, regardless of questions about their literal truth, that they represent important heritage deserving preservation and transmission, that they encode wisdom worth recovering and applying to contemporary challenges, even if the specific form that wisdom takes might be adapted for modern contexts. For non-Indigenous people, engaging with Native American demon beliefs, whether through academic study, personal interest, or creative inspiration, several ethical obligations deserve serious consideration. First, acknowledgement of sources and origins, ensuring that when we discuss or use these traditions, we clearly identify which indigenous nations they come from, rather than treating them as generic Native American material. Second, recognition of our limitations as outsiders, admitting that we cannot fully understand traditions developed within cultural contexts we do not share, that some knowledge may not be appropriate for us to access regardless of our interests or intentions, that indigenous peoples themselves are the primary authorities on their own traditions. Third, consideration of impact, thinking about how our engagement with indigenous traditions affects indigenous communities whether we contribute to harmful appropriation and misrepresentation, or whether we support indigenous cultural revitalization and sovereignty. Fourth, if our engagement with these traditions involves any commercial or professional benefit to ourselves, we should consider what we owe to the indigenous peoples from whom these traditions originate, whether simple acknowledgement is sufficient, or whether some form of tangible support or compensation is ethically required, recognizing that generations of extraction from indigenous cultures without reciprocity represents an ongoing injustice that we should not perpetuate. Fifth, when possible, we should seek to amplify indigenous voices telling their own stories rather than always centering non-indigenous interpretations and representations. Recognizing that the best understanding of Native American traditions comes from Native American people themselves. The demon beliefs we have explored tonight also offer resources for addressing contemporary challenges that extend beyond any particular culture. The Wendigo's representation of insatiable hunger that grows with feeding speaks powerfully to modern concerns about consumption, addiction, environmental destruction, and economic systems predicated on endless growth. The Skinwalker's embodiment of power gained through ultimate betrayal warns about what humans become when they abandon ethics and community in pursuit of selfish interests. The various child-protecting monsters remind us of adult obligations to safeguard the vulnerable and of the real dangers that threaten young people in every society. The water demons and environmental spirits encode ecological wisdom about respecting natural forces and living sustainably within ecosystem limits. Indigenous peoples themselves have increasingly used traditional demon stories to address contemporary issues facing their communities and the wider world, demonstrating the adaptability and continuing relevance of ancient wisdom. Native writers, filmmakers, artists, and educators draw on traditional supernatural beings to discuss everything from substance abuse and domestic violence within indigenous communities to climate change and corporate exploitation that threatens indigenous territories and all life on Earth. These modern applications of traditional stories show that the demons and monsters of the past still have power to teach, to warn, and to guide. That the wisdom encoded in supernatural narrative remains valuable regardless of whether we believe literally in the beings themselves. As we conclude this journey through Native American demon mythology, we must acknowledge that what we have covered represents only a small fraction of the vast richness of indigenous spiritual traditions, that hundreds of specific beliefs and stories remain unmentioned, that entire nations and regions received inadequate attention or no attention at all, that the complexity and depth of each tradition far exceeds what can be conveyed in even a lengthy survey such as this. Those who wish to understand these traditions more deeply should seek out indigenous voices telling their own stories, should read books by Native authors, should support indigenous cultural institutions and educational programs, should approach these traditions with humility and respect, rather than assuming that outsider understanding can ever be complete. For the indigenous peoples who have maintained these traditions through centuries of colonization, forced assimilation, cultural suppression, and ongoing challenges, these demon beliefs and the broader spiritual traditions they represent are not historical curiosities or academic subjects, but living heritage, connection to ancestors, ongoing relationship with spiritual forces and territories, essential components of cultural identity and continuity. The demons and monsters that their ancestors feared and respected and learned from continue to carry meaning, to teach lessons, to remind contemporary Indigenous peoples of who they are and where they come from, and what wisdom their cultures have developed across generations of experience. As we rest now, having walked with the Wendigo through winter forests, having glimpsed skinwalkers in the desert night, having heard raven mockers call at twilight, having avoided the grasp of basket woman, we carry with us appreciation for the sophistication of Indigenous spiritual thought, respect for the peoples who developed and maintain these rich traditions, recognition that questions about evil, danger, and supernatural threat are universal human concerns that different cultures address in different ways, that all deserve serious consideration. The demons of Indigenous North America may not be our demons, may not speak to our specific cultural contexts, but they speak to the universal human experience of facing dangers both external and internal, physical and spiritual, and attempting to understand and survive and maintain humanity in the face of forces that threaten to destroy or corrupt. May those who have shared these traditions with outsiders be honored for their generosity. May those who have maintained these traditions despite centuries of pressure to abandon them be recognized for their strength and commitment. May contemporary Indigenous peoples who continue to find meaning in ancient wisdom be supported in their cultural revitalization and sovereignty. May we all learn from the demons and monsters of the past to face the demons and monsters of the present with wisdom, courage, and respect for the knowledge that has been passed down through generations of human experience. The night is deep, the ancient stories have been told, and the spirits of the land remain as they have always been. Thank you for joining this exploration of Native American demon beliefs. Sleep well, knowing that understanding grows through respectful learning, that wisdom comes from many sources, and that the spiritual traditions of Indigenous peoples offer profound insights for anyone willing to listen with humility and respect.